Welcome to the final panel of our symposium on Berlin and the Cold War. This panel is called Beyond the Cold War in Berlin, 1972 to the 1990s. I'm Seth Givens. I'm a historian at the Marine Corps History Division. I'm co-organizer with Ingo Trauschweizer, who's the director of the Contemporary History Institute at Ohio University. We'd like to, before we get started, thank our sponsors once again. They're the ones who made this possible, but also international. So those sponsors include Checkpoint Charlie Foundation, the German Foreign Office and its consulate in Chicago, Society for Military History, Ohio University's Baker Peace Studies program. We also would like to thank the Allied Museum in Berlin and the Berlin Center for Cold War Studies for their assistance. Special thanks also goes to, as this is our last panel, to Connie Hunter of the Contemporary History Institute. She's always tirelessly devoted to making these events at CHI a success, and so far, if I don't jinx us, we have been successful. So this afternoon, we'll have a truly international panel. We're going to have presenters from Washington, D.C., from Berlin and Moscow. And we're going to continue today with our theme from the previous two panels. We're going to examine key aspects of a global event, which is the Cold War, through the lens of one city, and that's Berlin. Earlier today, we focused on the second period of crisis in Berlin, and we'll now shift to a post-crisis period, and indeed a post-Cold War era. So this panel is going to consider how the confrontation between East and West came to an end in Berlin, and then how some viewed the shift into a post-Cold War world. Now, for the sake of flow between presentations, I'm going to introduce the panelists now, and then we'll pass the baton between each speaker. So each panelist, just so everyone knows, they will have 20 to 25 minutes to present. And then if any of you in the audience have questions, please feel free to post them in YouTube chat or Facebook chat functions, and we'll then relay them to the presenters. And we'll hopefully have a 20 to 25 minute long question and answer period at the end. All right, our first panelist is Dr. Vladislav Zubok. Dr. Zubok is professor of international history at the London School of Economics. He earned degrees from Moscow State University and the Institute for the USA and Canada in Moscow. He's the author of 4 books, Zhivago's Children, The Last Russian Intelligentsia, A Failed Empire, the Soviet Union, the Cold War from Stalin to Gorbachev, The Idea of Russia, The Life and Works of Dmitry Ligachev, and his most recent book, which will come out next month with Yale University Press. It's called Collapse, The End of the Soviet Union. Dr. Zubok has taught at several prestigious universities across the United States, probably none more than our very own Ohio University. He's also taught at Amherst College, Stanford University, University of Michigan, and Temple University. He's the recipient of numerous grants as well as accolades for scholarship, such prizes as the Lionel Gelber Prize and the Marshall Schulman Prize. And he will be presenting on Berlin, Soviets, and the end of the Cold War. Our second panelist is Dr. Stephan Kieninger. Dr. Kieninger is a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's the author of 2 books on the history of the U.S. Cold War diplomacy toward Europe. First book was Diplomacy of Détente, Cooperative Security Policies from Helmut Schmidt to George Shultz. And I believe his first book actually was the second one is Dynamic Détente, the United States and Europe, 1964 to 1975. Dr. Kieninger is currently researching the Clinton administration's NATO-Russia policy through the prism of Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot and his statecraft. Kieninger received his PhD from Mannheim University in 2011, and he was formerly a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins SAIS, a fellow at the Berlin Center for Cold War Studies, and a senior researcher at the Federal German Archives. His presentation is titled Energy Policy as a Catalyst for Détente, Berlin and the Schmidt and Kohl Governments. And our final panelist is Dr. Peter Ritter. Dr. Ritter is a research assistant at the Berlin Center for Cold War Studies at the Leibnitz Institute for Contemporary History, Munich-Berlin. He has previously been a fellow at the Global Humanitarian Research Academy in Mainz, Geneva, and Exeter. And he's currently working on a project titled The Search for a New World Order, Envisioned Futures in the U.S. and West German Governments at the End of the Cold War, 1988, 1992. And some accolades should be given his way since he has a new book coming out next month called Human Rights and Competition, The Cold War and the Establishment of the UN Human Rights Protection System, 1965 to 1993. And if you can read German, then you'll be able to read that book. His presentation was titled Berlin 1989 and the New Atlanticism, U.S. and West German Visions for the Post-Cold War Architecture of Europe. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Zubok.
Well, thank you, Seth. How do I sound? The sound comes all right?
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay, so my presentation today will be dedicated to the Soviet political context of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And my main idea today is to suggest that Soviet domestic politics, above all politics of Gorbachev's perestroika, played an even greater role in conditioning the motives of Soviet leadership vis-à-vis Cold War status in Europe than the current literature implies. The first time I realized it myself, about 5 years ago, I began my research on a book about the Soviet collapse and agreed to write a piece for a volume on German reunification, co-edited by a number of esteemed colleagues, including my friend Mary Sorotti. So when I made my presentation on Gorbachev's approach to German reunification, a prominent historian of Soviet foreign policy, Wojtek Masny, remarked, I knew that the Soviet Union was nearing the crisis in 1989, but I didn't realize it was already in such a crisis. Indeed, I argue that it was this political crisis of perestroika, in addition to idealistic vision of Mikhail Gorbachev, that conditioned Soviet response to the eruption of East German crisis and the fall of the Berlin Wall. We, of course, know that the main driver of change in Soviet attitudes to Eastern Europe and the GDR was Mikhail Gorbachev. His perestroika and new political thinking were based on breathtaking idealist foundations. Gorbachev's new international strategy was his personal project, supported and shared by a small circle of westernized Soviet elites, mostly in the highest echelons of the Communist Party. And it was not clear for the main Soviet bureaucracies, including the army and security services. Gorbachevian concept was to end the Cold War and to open the Soviet Union to the West in order to modernize and democratize Soviet economy, society, and political system. The sweeping scheme envisaged retrenchment of Soviet sources in Asia, withdrawal from Afghanistan, reconciliation with China, and also idea of a common European home that completely shifted the priorities of Soviet foreign policy from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. Gorbachev repeatedly told Eastern European communist leaders since his coming to power in 1985 that the old relationship of big brother taking responsibility for little brothers belonged to the past. The new modus vivendi was the Soviet Union would not intervene anymore. Nobody in the West believed it. Nobody in Eastern Europe, including Erich Honecker, believed it, or for that matter, even Soviet bureaucracies, very few believed this idealistic modus would be implemented. In the spring of 1987, Gorbachev and his foreign minister, Eduard Shevardnadze, traveled to East Berlin to take part in a meeting of the Warsaw Treaty Organization there. During the meeting, they met with Honecker to discuss the issue of the Berlin Wall. We know, of course, that Khrushchev had approved the wall in 1961 as a temporary measure to let the GDR to construct socialism. 26 years later, the Soviet leadership wanted to remove this temporary measure, quote unquote, in the name of a common European home. In preparation of this meeting, Gorbachev told his assistants, Honecker cringes when we remind him about the wall. Therefore, we should tell him about it more tactfully, about the processes that are inevitable. Shevardnadze shared to his assistants what happened during the meeting. He said, we proposed to remove the wall. What did it mean? Maybe Gorbachev and Shevardnadze proposed to Honecker a gradual liberalization of inter-German tourism and human contacts. Maybe they had something more radical in common. Unfortunately, I found nothing more specific in the sources, but we know that in any case, Honecker rejected any changes and the issue was dropped. Gorbachev's line meant non-interference in every sense, including his refusal to press Eastern European regimes into reforms. In 1987, the Soviet leadership stopped advocating deeper ties with Hungary or expanding cooperation with the GDR. By 1988, Gorbachev began to think that Eastern European countries were a liability, not an asset for his perestroika. In the Soviet government, everybody knew that the communist regimes in Eastern Europe regarded Moscow as a source of oil and other subventions. During '88, Gorbachev, the Politburo, and the Soviet government launched far-reaching reforms that were designed to transform the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's main idea was socialist democracy, the concept based on idealistic reading of Lenin and a very different idea than liberal democracy. I have no time in this presentation to lay out this grand design, but would like to say that those reforms quickly undercut the main levers of the old Soviet system of governance: the total party control, the state control over economic production, resources, and trade, and the centralized control over finances, not to mention over ideology. In combination with the runaway glasnost, the discussion of all aspects of Soviet past and present, Gorbachevian reforms quickly unleashed a political and social crisis of major proportions that would overwhelm him already during the summer of 1989. In anticipation of these radical reforms, people around Gorbachev wondered if there need to be some kind of plan B for Eastern Europe, if liberalization there would suddenly take a radical turn and would endanger Gorbachev's perestroika. After all, the same had happened in Poland and Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and it ended very badly for those countries, but also for Soviet reformist projects. In October '88, Gorbachev's assistant for Eastern Europe, Georgy Shakhnazarov, warned his boss, that is Gorbachev, that this issue could no longer be postponed. He wrote that Eastern Europe became dependent on Western banks and might change its political regime soon. How the USSR should react to this course of events? And would the presence of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe remain in Soviet interests? Shakhnazarov seems to know the answers to those questions. He told Gorbachev that Eastern Europe was a parasite on the body of Soviet economy. Most of leaders of the Soviet bloc were enemies of Gorbachev's radical reforms, and Soviet troops should leave the region as soon as possible. He was careful, however, to make an exception for East Germany. Soviet troops, he wrote to Gorbachev, remained there on the basis of the Potsdam Accords of 1945, in the presence of a peace agreement that had to be comprehensive, in the absence of a peace agreement that had to be comprehensive and involving great powers. I should also mention that Shakhnazarov was a war veteran that fought against the Nazi Germany from 1941 to 1945. In early '89, as Soviet political reform was launched, the Politburo Commission, headed by Alexander Yakovlev, who fully shared Gorbachev's idealistic vision, agreed that the optimal outcome would be a gradualist scenario. Eastern European countries would move to social democratic regimes and get reintegrated into West German economy. Actually, the Commission of Yakovlev concluded it would be great if the Soviet economy somehow get a chance to return to Europe on the coattails of Eastern Europeans. The gradualist scenario seemed to have worked in Poland in June-August 1989, when the Round Table brought Solidarity to power to replace Polish communists in the parliament. The first non-communist government was formed, while presidency still belonged to General Jaruzelski, Gorbachev's favorite man in Poland. This gradualist scenario, however, came to be disrupted already in the spring and summer of 1989. Normally, when you read Western literature, it points to the opening of the border in Hungary that was facilitated by a financial deal between the Hungarian Reform Communist government and Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Kohl. This factor certainly set in motion the avalanche of events, with East German refugees to Hungary, an unexpected political crisis in the GDR. What the Western accounts do not take into consideration, however, and what I want to emphasize, is that the depth of the political turmoil that broke out at the same time inside the Soviet Union. Against the background of this turmoil, suddenly, foreign policy in Eastern Europe went to the back bench. The Soviet leadership became fully preoccupied with domestic troubles. And those troubles included, to name a few, a massive strike of Soviet miners, about 200,000, in Kuzbas and Donbas, the main mining areas, the largest industrial action in Soviet history. People began to talk about Soviet solidarity, modeled after Polish one. It took weeks of talks between the Soviet government and the miners' committees. Billions of allocations from the government to placate the strikers and end this wave of strikes. There was also explosion of violence in South Caucasus, including the area of Nagorno-Karabakh in Georgia, where ethnic nationalists declared de facto secession from the Soviet Union. The nationalist violence and separatism could not be controlled and placated, could not be bribed by money. Things only grew worse every day. In the Baltic republics, the Baltic Chain or Baltic Way took place in August 1989. With many economic and political concessions that the Gorbachev government had made to the Balts in 1988 and early 89, nationalists in those three republics wanted to secede from the Union, and they were able to mobilize millions to support their cause. The Soviet Union was a federation held together by the Communist Party, the fear of the KGB, economic and financial levers. All those hoops suddenly became loosened up during 1989, and instead of reforms from above, there were calls for a revolutionary change inside the Soviet Union. Rapid radicalization took place in the heart of reformed Soviet political system, inside the elected Congress of People's Deputies and the new permanent legislature, the Supreme Soviet. Hundreds of elected representatives, almost overnight, turned from reform-minded and compliant party members into radicals who wanted a complete overhaul of the Soviet system, and to do so quickly. Trips abroad at the invitation of Western parliaments and think tanks during the summer of 1989 greatly contributed to a revolutionizing experience of those people. Before the spring of 1989, only a few reformers in Moscow westernized elite thought in terms of an overhaul, a revolutionary overhaul. For instance, Gorbachev's foreign policy aide Anatoly Chernyaev wrote in his private diary, I quote, "The old system, the old regime must go, should be destroyed, and only then the society, acting on self-preservation instincts, would resurrect itself from scratch." Now, those were striking words in the spring of 1989. By the fall of 1989, there were thousands, tens of thousands of people who formed a political opposition around these ideas, and this opposition quickly took anti-communist character. Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, Yakovlev, and other party reformers at the top of power pyramid knew that the main question was no longer Eastern Europe, no longer Outer Empire. It was the unity of the Soviet Union itself. In August 1989, Shevardnadze's speechwriter Stepanov traveled with his boss, Shevardnadze, to Georgia during August, the time of vacations. At that time, when momentous changes began in Eastern Europe, the Soviet foreign minister, the minister of a superpower, dedicated his energy to brokering a truce between Georgians and Abkhazians in an interethnic conflict. It is clear, wrote Stepanov in his diary on August 19, 1989, after reading the news about the new non-communist Mazovietsky government coming to power. It is clear that we will not intervene into Polish affairs. We are stuck with our own disarray that we should fix. But how? Wherever you look, Hungary, the Baltics, or across the fence, everywhere is disintegration of the order and the former state of things. At the same time, the Romanian ruler Ceausescu requested an emergency meeting of the Warsaw Pact to deal with this matter. Stepanov reacted in his diary with fatalism. In the key country of the communist bloc, he wrote, socialism is coming to an end calmly, without agony and painful convulsions. Gorbachev himself spent his vacation in August 1989 thinking mostly about the Baltic states and how to deal with Baltic separatism. The KGB, the GRU, the diplomats stationed in Eastern Europe and of course in East Berlin, bombarded Moscow in vain with their warnings about the political flood in the region. The Soviet embassy in the GDR proposed to interfere into East German political crisis to work out political measures to regain initiative. The leadership in Moscow ignored those messages. Finally, Gorbachev reluctantly agreed to take part in the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the GDR on October 7, 1989. He did not know what to say to East German leaders. Gorbachev goes to the GDR without a coherent policy, cabled the well-informed British ambassador British ambassador to London from Moscow. I continue the quote from his diary. While he shuts his eyes and hopes that the German question will go away, events on the ground are overtaking him. Chernayev, Gorbachev's assistant for foreign policy, quoted his boss saying that he wanted to go to Berlin to support the revolution, the end of quote. It was a bizarre remark, the leader of the top communist country going to express his solidarity with those in East Germany who demanded the end of the Soviet-made system. Yet, at that time and before, Gorbachev was on a mission to transform the system in his own country. Way too much has been read into Gorbachev's visit to East Berlin in early October. In reality, by that time, the fate of the GDR was sealed. When Egon Krenz dismissed Honecker and came to Moscow to ask for financial assistance from the USSR, Gorbachev was shocked by the size of the GDR debt and made it clear that the East Germans were on their own. The Soviet budget had no hard currency for the country that used to be its most precious satellite in Eastern Europe. The last chance for a gradualist scenario was tried by the Krenz government to open regular service of letting people of the GDR out and in through the wall, yet the famous or infamous Shabovsky incident turned this last chance to dust. The post-wall effect now stood for a triumph of the West over the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's biographer William Taubman sums up what follows. The fall of the Berlin Wall eventually changed almost everything. Until then, Gorbachev was prime initiator of change. Afterward, he had to react to changes initiated by others, by masses of people on the ground in the GDR, by Eastern European politicians moving beyond communism, by Western European and American leaders ignoring or challenging Gorbachev's vision. Gorbachev himself, I would say, however, seemed not to grasp the symbolic and potential significance of what happened. He was too busy with internal troubleshooting in his own country. On the night the wall was breached, the Gorbachevian Politburo retired very late after a long discussion of internal problems, above all in Lithuania. 6 days later, in a public speech, the Soviet leader rejected Margaret Thatcher's declaration about the crumbling of totalitarian socialist system in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev told the British ambassador with incredible aplomb that the events are going in the right direction. Perestroika will reach out to you as well, he promised. He refused to admit, perhaps even to himself, that his beautiful vision of a more open Soviet Union, gradually integrated into a common European home, became a victim of the Eastern Europe's political stampede. That would be the end of my brief presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zubok. Dr. Kieninger?
Yep. Okay, you can all hear me and see me. Wonderful. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the kind invitation. I'm really glad to do this and to be here. And I have something important to say, something that is often missed, I think. So what I have to say pertains to Berlin and to Ostpolitik and détente in general. My message is that détente in Europe was sustainable, and this long détente included Berlin. And this is an important message because it is often neglected. I give you an example. Let's talk about 1983, which was a key year. When you ask your students about their thoughts when they hear 1983, they may say, well, that's the year of the missile when NATO began deploying Pershing II and cruise. And they may also say that was a dangerous year, including multiple crises. war scare, Able Archer, the Soviet shoot-down of the Korean airliner, etc. All of this is in the TV series Germany 1983. The sensation, the danger, and all of this is true. But now comes what I have to add in terms of inner German relations. And Berlin 1983 did not see any crisis. Rather, 1983 brought tremendous progress. Let's first talk about Berlin. In 1983, there was agreement that West Berlin would soon be connected to the Siberian gas pipeline that was under construction, the largest pipeline for the transport of natural gas from the Soviet Union to Western Europe, supplying 20 million households with natural gas. And Berlin was part of this project. Both Germany's and the Soviets agreed to construct a stub pipeline from the Czechoslovakian border to Berlin, 250 kilometers on the GDR's territory. And the GDR received transit fees, a key project to meet rising energy demands in West Berlin. So there was absolutely no revival of Cold War tensions in Berlin. Quite to the contrary, and that is quite remarkable. There was no legal haggling over the construction of that stub pipeline, and all of this was in the shadow of the Euro missile crisis in 1983. This is a key message. So economically, Berlin turned into a hub for joint East-West projects. This had been unthinkable before. And the détente agreements, the Quadripartite agreement, the basic treaty of 1972 made this possible. The Germans, East Germans and West Germans could do this without interference from the four powers. And with regards to the basic treaty of 1972, Helmut Sonnenfeld, Henry Kissinger's advisor, had been predicting this, I quote, "The treaty, in effect, fully Germanizes the German question, with the Allied role even in Berlin being relegated to minor importance. It is astonishing in how many areas the East Germans have agreed to open themselves up to dealings with the FRG. Brandt has gone a long way towards achieving the Annäherung, which Bahr set as a policy objective a decade ago. The East German regime has decided to take the risk that this will cause some Wandel in its internal structure too, and in relations with West Germany," end of quote. Now, Berlin was still a cause for enormous diplomatic battles. Détente did not imply that you kiss and make friends, but détente did imply pragmatism and the search for a more attainable peace, as John F. Kennedy had once put it, and that included Berlin. So all of this was entirely different from the Cold War confrontation in the 1950s. Moreover, in 1983, the two Germanys revived the negotiations on a cultural agreement. They concluded an environmental agreement, and the GDR's Reichsbahn and the West Berlin Senate agreed on the takeover of the S-Bahn in West Berlin by the Senate, which was also an important step to facilitate traffic in Berlin. Moreover, in 1982, there was the opening of a superhighway linking Hamburg and Berlin, the two largest cities of divided Germany. And West Germans with transit visa were allowed to use the road for visits to Berlin. And even border controls were less harassing for some time in 1983. And why was all of this possible in 1983? Well, because the West Germans bailed out the East German regime in 1983. The West German Billion Deutschmark Kredit, the Milliardenkredit, saved the GDR from bankruptcy. And in return, the East Germans allowed for more contacts and more cooperation. So the deal was effectively more contacts in return for cash. So the Kohl government continued the Deutschlandpolitik and Ostpolitik that Brandt and Schmidt and Scheel and Genscher had initiated. And even Kohl pursued it with more vigor. So this is an important 1983 story. And I would suggest we could do a new version of the TV series Germany 1983. And my main actors would be Franz Josef Strauß and Alexander Schark-Golodkowski, the leader from Bavaria and the GDR's hard currency fundraiser. What a combination. They negotiated the Milliardenkredit, and they were a good negotiating team. And they had about 13 top secret meetings in 1983 and 1984 and exchanged hundreds of back channel messages. And the Federal German Archives published a document edition, including these transcripts of their meetings. I was part of the editing team when I worked at the Federal German Archives. The edition is published, Dokumente zur Deutschlandpolitik, came out 3 years ago. And I wrote 2 essays on the Milliardenkredit, one in English, one in German. I'd be happy to share them. And I'd also wrote a blog post on the Schark-Golodkowski papers at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's available at the Woodrow Wilson Center's website. So check it out and have a look. So I could go on and talk about Schark and Strauß for hours, but that's not the purpose of my paper, because my argument is the long détente and financial interdependence and infrastructure projects. And all of this started in Brandt's time as a chancellor and in Schmidt's chancellorship as well. The basic thing was that the East German regime was hooked for West German money, and the Deutschmark was the golden fish hook, so to say. And Helmut Schmidt used this hook right away in 1974 when he assumed his chancellorship. He used it towards Moscow, and he used it towards the GDR. And he used it as an incentive for energy projects. And in 1974, his idea was to build a nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union in Kaliningrad and to supply West Berlin with energy from this nuclear power plant in Kaliningrad via Poland and via the GDR's territory. A huge project. So the idea was to have Kraftwerksunion, German company, construct this power plant and to give the Soviet Union credits and to pursue this over a long, really a long term. And this was an amazing project, an entirely new project, and it had been unthinkable before Ostpolitik. So this would be not just a win-win, but it would be a quadruple win. A win for the Germans as Berlin's energy supply would be secured. A win for the Soviets as they would get credits from the Germans to do this and latest state-of-the-art technology as well. And a win for Poland and the GDR as they would get transit fees as well. So all of this was in 1974 at the outset of Schmidt's chancellorship, and it resembled Schmidt's hard-nosed and pragmatic style. And Schmidt discussed this on the occasion of his first visit in Moscow as chancellor in October 1974. So the commercial aspects of this deal were in place, and this was later on in 75 and 76 not negotiated in the ordinary diplomatic channels. Schmidt discussed this himself with Brezhnev in 1975 also when they met at the Helsinki summit. And this was a key issue for the back channel negotiators, Egon Bahr and Valery Letnev and Vyacheslav Kevorkov. It's in my last book on the diplomacy of détente. I saw the papers, these back channel communication papers at the Helmut Schmidt's archive and in Egon Bahr's papers at the Social Democratic Archive in Bonn. All of the aspects were in place, but finally the deal did not materialize. Why? Because it ran counter to the Ford administration's new non-proliferation policy. Ford pursued a stricter non-proliferation policy after India's first nuclear test in May 1974. So Ford was really determined to curb nuclear export, and the Schmidt government offered, okay, that it could apply COCOM. It could apply for COCOM approval for the export of nuclear technology. And what the Ford administration did was it indicated its approval provided that the Soviets would allow for safety checks by the International Atomic Energy Organization. So finally, this linkage killed the deal in 1976. So the deal was that there would be no nuclear power plant in Kaliningrad. So what could Helmut Schmidt do? He waited until his re-election in 76, and he waited until the Soviet Party Congress in 76 as well. So in 1978, he took a new initiative when he invited Brezhnev to Germany, and at their meeting in May 1978, they established a political framework for the construction of that Siberian gas pipeline. And I would call this an exercise in diplomatic cathedral building, establishing agreements and institutions with the duration of cathedrals. They concluded a 25-year economic framework agreement, lots of effort, but this agreement would last for a decade. And they got Deutsche Bank involved to finance the pipeline construction, and they got several other countries on board: France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, Italy, and all of them would receive gas from the pipeline. So it was a multilateral project, not a bilateral project like Nord Stream 2 over the heads of so many countries. And the important thing from Schmidt's vantage point was that this was more than just trade. It was a political project and a counter to the Euro missile crisis. Schmidt already sensed that the Euro missile crisis would dominate policies for the next years to come. So Schmidt said, we need this pipeline as a way to counter the Euro missile crisis. And in 1978, he told British Prime Minister Callaghan, I quote from the British record, what Schmidt said, quote, the Russians would not reduce their armaments, but the goal should be to engage them in a joint perspective of trade, industry, and technology over the next 20 years, within would emerge a greater Soviet dependence upon European supplies. This would result in more European influence on their policies. Their planning system was very rigid, and their plans for the next 5 to 10 years equally so. They could not accommodate short-term change. If, however, they could rely on a long-term perspective of the kind he had described, they would take it into account. End of quote. And trade had yet another important function. Trade was a way to buy Germans out from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And Schmidt was determined to fight for the continuation of Ostpolitik, despite the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, despite the declaration of martial law in Poland. And this was really a crucial theme, despite the Carter administrations and Reagan's sanction. And he made this clear when he had a diplomatic battle with Helmut Schmidt at the Venice World Economic Summit in 1980. He told Carter, I quote again, the main objectives are A, to make it possible for as many Germans to come to Germany, and B, to build as good a human relationship as possible between East and West. The federal government, without any publicity, were succeeding in getting 30 to 40,000 Germans out of Poland each year. The price paid within the Helsinki framework and the framework of various bilateral agreements was to have economic exchanges with Eastern European countries. These exchanges were, therefore, far more than a mere matter of trade. They made it possible for the German government to get their own people out. End of quote. So this brings me to my last point. There was not only a long détente, but the long détente was also a transformative détente, actually. Ostpolitik brought changes, and these changes were intended. Ostpolitik was not just about facilitating contacts, it had a deeper purpose. Changes. The aim was to work for Germany's unification in a new Europe, whole and free. And this approach was not focused on the classical German unification approach. Rather, unification was conceived as a distant objective. For the time being, it was decisive to remain a sense of Germanness and to expand human contacts. The concept was that both Germanys would come closer and closer to each other in economic, cultural, and social ways in movement of people. And this rationale was successful. I give you a number. Prior to the conclusion of the Grundlagenvertrag in 1972, the number of annual visits from the Federal Republic and West Berlin to the GDR in East Berlin was about 2.5 million people. As a result of détente, this number rose to more than 8 million people in 1976, and that's an enormous number. And the Helsinki Final Act codified the premises of this dynamic détente policy, and trade and credits and infrastructure projects kept this dynamic détente process alive. The East German regime and the Soviets knew about the dangers, but they decided that economic benefits were more important. The assumption was that they could cope with the multiplication of societal contacts. This was a wrong assumption, as we all know. In 1963, Willy Brandt made no bones that the objective was, I quote, the transformation of the other side, end of quote. The difficult task was to balance power and mission in inner German relations. How much stability do you need and how much change can you achieve over the long term? In 1969, Egon Bahr said that the crucial question was how one could, I quote again, disengage the Soviets from Eastern Europe step by step. Bahr argued that the only way is beginning projects that link Eastern and Western Europe in ways the Soviets don't consider dangerous. Bahr emphasized that, I quote again, you bring this about only if you don't put Soviet domination into question. He reiterated that, quote, this is a long procedure with its own contradictions, but it is the only way unless you give up the objective of liberating Europe, end of quote. So to sum it up, Ostpolitik was tremendously successful and Berlin was an essential part of it. Let's mention the various stages again. Brandt's policy of small steps, Wandel durch Annäherung, the Eastern treaties, the Quadripartite Agreement on Berlin, the Basic Treaty, the Helsinki Final Act, the many inner German treaties, the Milliardenkredite. All of this was an irreversible process, a huge toolbox with a variety of instruments and a role model of sustainable diplomacy and cooperative security. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ritter.
Yes. All right. Yeah, thank you, Tess. I also want to thank Ingo and Connie for making this event possible in these very troubled times. And before I start, I also have to say that even though I'm working on this project here, which I will present today, since 2019, it's still in a very preliminary stadium because when I wanted to go to the United States in 2020 to start with my archival research, 2 days before I could catch my flight to New York, the US president decided to close the border for European citizens. And that's why I haven't been able to go to the US to do research in the archives until today. And also German archives were closed for a very long time. So what I will present here today are first sketches for 2 chapters of my new project, which still need to have more sources and to be more outlined. So I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards and also are open for suggestions and ideas. The topic I will talk today is Berlin 1989 and the New Atlanticism, US and West German visions for the post-Cold War architecture of Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989 was a decisive moment in the European and world history. Overnight, the people of Berlin peacefully forced the German question back on the agenda of international politics. The reunification of Germany seemed inevitable, and in the following month, politicians in East and West announced competing concepts for the future architecture of a post-Cold War Europe. On December 12th, US Secretary of State James Baker traveled to West Berlin to present the idea for a new Europe, a new Atlanticism. In this concept, NATO, the European Community, and the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe formed the framework for the reunification of Germany and laid the foundation for the new political order in Europe after the Cold War. This conservative approach, as Christina Spohr described it, was built on the prefab structures developed during the Cold War, as Mary-Elise Sorotti had shown. But it prevailed during the following negotiations for the 2+4 agreement in 1990, whereas alternative visions like Gorbachev's Common European Home or Mitterrand's Gaullist dream of a European Confederation failed to succeed. In the following 20 minutes, I will take a closer look at the concepts developed within the West German and US administration in 1989 to overcome the division of Europe. First, I want to know what concepts were developed by George Herbert Walker Bush and his Secretary of State James Baker on the one side, and by Helmut Kohl and Hans-Dietrich Genscher on the other side. Second, I want to analyze how they influenced each other and how the conceptualization changed during the events in 1989 and especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. My argument is that the concept of New Atlanticism was shaped by the special German relationship in 1989. To support my thesis, I will first analyze the West German concept of a European peace order developed by Hans-Dietrich Genscher and Helmut Kohl. In the second step, I will take a closer look at the US concept of a Commonwealth of Free Nations presented by Bush in May 1989. At third, I will finally show how the US perception changed after the fall of the Berlin Wall and how US and German visions for a future political architecture of Europe converged within the concept of New Atlanticism. The European Peace Order, the Europäische Friedensordnung in German. The idea of a European peace order goes back to the détente policy of the 1960s and was taken up by Genscher in 1987 in reaction to Gorbachev's idea of a common European home. It reflected his adherence to the spirit of détente policy from the 1960s and 70s and was based on the presumption that a peaceful order in Europe that reunites the countries of East and West could only be achieved through cooperation on the basis of shared values like human rights and democracy. In reference to the Harmer Report from 1967, in which NATO members outlined how to combine deterrence and détente, Genscher advertised his concept extensively in 1988. Thereby, NATO should guarantee the stability and security of Western European countries, while the Conference for Security and Cooperation should be a platform for intensified cooperation between East and West to support the implementation of human rights and democracy in Eastern Europe. This goal was to reunite Europe in a new entity where socialist and capitalist countries could peacefully live together on the basis of shared values. But this concept was contested within the political discourse in West Germany in 1988. And while the Social Democrats and the Green Party still adhered to the ideal of a democratic socialism, conservatives thought it was too moderate and that the Western alliance should reinforce political and military pressure on the Eastern European countries. However, after Gorbachev's famous speech at the UN General Assembly in December 1988, where he declared the Cold War to be over and announced a unilateral reduction of Soviet military in Eastern Europe, the political perception changed in West Germany. Now also Helmut Kohl adopted the idea of a European peace order and made it his own. Two convictions shaped Kohl's concept. First, a commitment to the transatlantic partnership. He was convinced that the United States and NATO not only ensured European security, but were also important factors in the democratization of Western Europe after World War II. Second, the process of European integration. For Kohl, a European peace order could only be achieved within the framework of a European community. He wanted to incorporate the Eastern European countries into this process to become members in a future European entity that was not only an economic affiliation, but also a political union. Now about the US concept. In 1989, the Bush administration was generally recognized as dealing in an ad hoc manner with the dramatic developments in Eastern Europe and not being creative in what the US president himself called the vision thing in an interview in 1988. As Bush took office in January 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev had set the tone for the reapproachment between East and West. with his famous speech at the UN General Assembly. The new US administration was in a tight spot to win back the offensive within the public discourse, and overall the situation was less advantageous than it was later presented by the participants. The US economy was still struggling from the 1987 recession, and the fiscal deficit was dangerously growing. Germany and Japan became serious economic competitors, and on Capitol Hill, politicians feared that the European integration could lead to a fortress Europe where US companies were forced out of the European single market. Besides this, politically, the decreasing tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States aroused people's doubts about the US engagement in Europe and the huge military spending for European security. Adding more concerns, West Germany, a vital NATO member, was from the perspective of some foreign policy experts, including Henry Kissinger and Richard Byrd, in danger of switching sides and colluding with Gorbachev to achieve reunification. The controversy about the modification of NATO's short nuclear force also amplified concerns about the transatlantic alliance disintegrating. All these developments amplified the fear of an imperial overstretch and the US decline as it was predicted by Paul Kennedy in his famous book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, in 1988. To regain the offensive, Bush counteracted after a 5-month-long policy pause and presented his concept to overcome the division and to secure US influence in Europe. In a speech at the A&M University in Texas on May 12, Bush acknowledged the ongoing transformation in Eastern Europe and offered Gorbachev to move beyond containment. He declared that the new strategy of his administration was not simply aiming at containing Soviet expansionism anymore, but rather to integrate the Soviet Union and the Eastern European states into the community of nations by supporting democratization and market reforms. However, he also urged his listeners still to be cautious and to stay strong so that the Soviet Union would have no reward in pursuing expansionism again. The idea to move beyond containment came from Brent Scowcroft, Bush's security advisor, and reflected the reluctance within the US administration to trust Gorbachev and his political reforms. Hawks, like Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, suspected a ploy to deceive the Western countries and pushed for a hard stance against the Soviets. In a second speech in Boston on May 21st, Bush emphasized the importance to strengthen the political ties to the European community and acknowledged that the economic success of the Western European countries was a magnet for the Eastern Europeans, drawing them closer to what he called then a Commonwealth of Free Nations. His reference about the Western European countries reflected the concerns within the US administration that the United States could be forced out of Europe when the countries in East and West align and form a strong European entity in the future. Bush justified this approach by arguing that the history of the 20th century, with its 2 devastating world wars, had proven that the USA needed to be involved in Europe to preserve international peace. But considering the international and domestic developments in late 1980s, it became clear that it was a vital interest of the USA to obtain its dominance in Europe, to secure its status as a global superpower, which was essential for US prosperity. Finally, in his third speech in West Germany on May 30th, Bush combined those 2 concepts and declared that it was his goal to move beyond containment, to create a Commonwealth of Free Nations, and to achieve a Europe whole and free. He wanted to integrate the Eastern European countries into the existing international system established by the United States after World War II. Bush's concept of a Commonwealth of Free Nations lacked concrete ideas how to support the Eastern Europeans and was mainly focused on securing the US presence in European soil. To achieve that, Bush and Baker followed a 2-track approach. First, they wanted to stabilize NATO by giving it a new purpose in the changing political environment. Therefore, at the NATO summit in late May 1989, Bush accepted Kohl's proposal to urge the Eastern European countries to implement market reforms, human rights, and democratic procedures. Beyond that, he demanded the acceleration and expansion of conventional disarmament negotiations with the Soviet Union. With these political claims, NATO was successfully turned into a political instrument which symbolically supported the transformation in Eastern Europe and could hopefully sustain in future. The second approach was to strengthen the political ties to West Germany to gain access to European politics beyond NATO. West Germany had a lot of leverage in Eastern Europe, and as a major economic power and a founding member of the European community, the country was a strategic ally for the US, as Robert Blackwell and Philip Zelikow had pointed out to Bush and Baker in a memorandum in mid-March. By offering Helmut Kohl to become a partner in leadership, on May 13th, during his first visit, Bush assured the US-German allegiance. Flattered by this offer, Kohl knew that this was a win-win situation for both of them. The West German Chancellor was in need of a strong ally to strengthen his domestic standing and to enforce his idea of a European peace order. The US concept in mid-1989 focused mainly on NATO and the bilateral relations to Germany. They had no specific strategy how to support the transformation in Eastern Europe, and the EC and the CSC were only barely mentioned. That changed in November 1989 when the people of Berlin again changed the course of history. And now to the third part of the new Atlanticism. The fall of the Berlin Wall accelerated the pressure on the US administration to present a new, more specific strategy how to handle the question of reunification and to present a more coherent vision for the future of Europe. When James Baker traveled to Berlin on December 12, 1989, he was aware of the symbolic importance of his journey. 2 weeks prior to his trip, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl had announced his 10-point program for the reunification of Germany in the Bundestag, and people all over the world wanted to know how the US government would handle the situation. In his 10-point program, Kohl presented a slow and cautious approach to his idea of a European peace order. The unification of Germany and Europe should be achieved within the framework of the European integration, supported by enhanced CSC negotiations and backed by strong transatlantic ties to the United States. The incorporation of the reunification process into the European community and the Conference for Security and Cooperation, as well as the US alliance, should assure Germany's neighbors that a reunified Germany would not be a future threat to them. Kohl intentionally didn't mention NATO in his plan because he was aware that the NATO membership of a reunified Germany would be the most difficult question in the upcoming negotiations with the Soviet Union. Although worried that Kohl didn't mention NATO, Bush in general welcomed the initiative of the German Chancellor. Since May, both were in close contact and regularly exchanged their views about the changing situation in Eastern Europe. During the summer of 1989, Bush had visited some Eastern European countries, and the ongoing stream of refugees from East Germany convinced him that first, the transformation in Eastern Europe was irreversible, and second, that the European community was a major magnet for these people and therefore a driving force he had to include. The fall of the Berlin Wall ultimately amplified this conviction and thereby changed the US perception. The European integration and the CSCE were from now on seen as important tools to achieve what Bush called a Europe whole and free. When the US president met with Gorbachev in Malta on December 2nd and 3rd, he had already placed himself behind Kohl's approach. On the following NATO summit in Brussels, he presented his first ideas for the future shape of a new Europe and a new Atlanticism, as he called it. But it was Baker's job after the summit to present the full US strategy to the public. In his speech on December 12th, in front of the Berlin Press Club at the Steigenberger Hotel, the US Secretary of State sketched out the vision for the future architecture of a post-Cold War Europe. The concept of a new Atlanticism followed 3 lines. The first was to transform NATO into a political forum for consultation between Western countries so that it could sustain in the future even without the Soviet threat. Second was to accept that the European integration will form the framework for the unified Europe and to assure that the United States do not see this as an endangering for US interests. To codify this, Baker demanded a transatlantic declaration to secure future consolidation and cooperation between the European community and the United States. The third line was to enforce the CSE as an instrument to support the reapproachment and transformation of Eastern Europe. The concept of a new Atlanticism combined key aspects of the West German European peace order as well as of the US concept of Commonwealth of Free Nations. It reveals how different concepts influenced each other and thereby illustrates the crucial role of the US-German partnership in 1989. To my conclusion, the relationship between the United States and Europe were at a crossroads in 1989. The concept of a new Atlanticism prevailed during the following 2+4 negotiations, and Bush and Kohl worked closely together to enforce their vision for the future architecture of post-Cold War Europe. Years later, participants like Condoleezza Rice, Philip Zelikow, and Robert Hutchings described this as a moment of triumph in the history of the US foreign policy. In their view, James Baker and George Bush recognized the opportunity to reunite Germany and to establish a post-Cold War order and benefit for whole Europe. This triumphalistic historical narrative enhanced during the Trump administration, where the prudent and forward-looking diplomacy of Bush and Baker was put in contrast to the erratic and short-sighted foreign policy of Donald Trump. The Russian critique forwarded by Vladimir Putin that the United States exploited the situation in 1980 and played off Gorbachev to expand NATO, and thereby their influence in Eastern Europe amplified this triumphalist interpretation of the events of 1989 and 1990 within the public discourse. The analysis of the development of the concept of a new Atlanticism shows that this approach was rather not led by a spirit of triumph within the Bush administration, but by deep concerns of losing influence and the US decline after the Cold War. However, the short unipolar moment of triumph came only in 1991, after the United States successfully liberated Kuwait from Iraqi occupation with the full support of the international community, but not in 1989. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ritter. Okay, we're right on schedule. We have a little over 25 minutes for a Q&A period. And these were all very good papers, and I think that they actually really cover the arc of the post-1971 quadripartite agreement period in Berlin. And we see the whole arc of it: Berlin as a means of détente, Berlin and its use in communist reforms, and then Berlin after the wall. So I guess we'll start the conversation trying to incorporate everyone here. And I wonder, we've been talking about the last 2 days about Berlin can be used or was used as a means of solidarity, of course, and solidarity and also reform. But it was also used as a way of division. But none of these papers we hear anything of division, really. We hear Berlin being used for solidarity and reform. So I wonder why and how there was that change in the 1980s. Was it because of the post-71 quadripartite agreement? Was it that agreement, or was it a sign of the times of the Cold War? Feel free, anyone, to answer that or to not answer it.
I think the key was that these agreements from the 1970s turned out to be stable. They turned out to be irreversible, and particularly the Quadripartite agreement was in everybody's interest. Nobody wanted a revival of Cold War tensions in Berlin. That would have just been too dangerous. You had so many crisis moments in Poland and everywhere that would just have been too dangerous. Also, yeah, I mean, everybody was interested in keeping quiet and calm in West Berlin. I mean, you had the global Cold War and escalations in many areas, but Berlin was a different thing. It was just the cornerstone of it all. I remember a quote of Richard Nixon in 1971. He says, "Hey man, shit, Berlin is it? If something happens in Berlin, you're at it, right?" So it was just too dangerous, and in this sense, it was in everybody's interest to have quiet in Berlin. And I mean, of course, you had diplomatic battles over and over again, but no military battles, no battle on the modus vivendi in Berlin.
Yeah, I've struggled with this with my own work too. The question of, in the 1980s, was Berlin therefore insulated from the Cold War?
Yeah.
For those reasons, and why? And of course, it was still used rhetorically.
Right.
Reagan's a great example, of course.
Right.
But I wonder, had the rhetorical, apart from Reagan and the use of it in the Cold War, had the rhetorical importance of Berlin lessened by the 1980s?
I would say in the late 1980s, yes, especially then during the Bush administration. As you mentioned Reagan before, he visited Berlin several times, and he had his famous speech in front of the Berlin Wall. And Bush also referred in his speeches to Berlin. But in general, it was not part of his concepts he developed at that time, and he didn't prolong or took over Reagan's initiative for Berlin. Reagan announced in 1987. And I also see in source material of meetings, especially from West Berlin mayor with US politicians, that there was not much interest in 1989 to proceed this process, which was started by Reagan, but was not kept on in the following years. And then when the events kept on ongoing, the issue of Berlin lost its importance there. I mean, Berlin as a symbol for the Cold War. I mean, it still was important when the wall came down, and people referred to it, but it was also very difficult to tackle the political situation, and no one wanted to incorporate this in negotiations, even if it was not necessary.
Mm-hmm. Peter, what struck me, your and Stephan's papers were very similar, I think, in the way that there was the potential that the four powers had lost the ability to react to changes in geopolitical frameworks, at least as it pertained to Germany. So I wondered if either of you could speak about that, or if that's even true. Is that a wrong interpretation?
I'd say it's a correct interpretation. Sometimes there was some minor, say, four power complaints about a lack of consultation, say in 1983 when that stub pipeline was constructed. Sometimes the U.S. ambassador would complain, had minor complaints about the lack of consultation, but that was basically it. So no more for power interference there, and this is really astonishing. But I quoted Sonnenfeld in 1972. He had kind of predicted it, and that was the basic rationale of Brandt's Ostpolitik. Like after the construction of the wall in '61, he said, okay, we got to take matters into our own hands. We got to do it ourselves. The four powers are not going to help us in all of this. We have to be. This is our own interest. We got to do it. We got to do it in consultation with them. But this was more and more just an inner German thing. That would be my take on it. Also on the Milliardenkredit, it was also important, like to bail out the GDR in a crisis situation. What would have happened if they had not bailed them out in 83? That could have been I don't know, more tensions within the GDR or more hard line in foreign policy. Rather bail them out and not let them collapse in a moment of crisis. So they collapsed 6 years later when the overall the international climate was completely different. I mean, yeah.
Right. I think there's also the what links the two papers that you two presented was also economic reform, and I'm wondering, Stephan, the use of trade as politics. Did the West Germans learn something from the Marshall Plan?
Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. They learned something from the Marshall Plan. Extend a hand of friendship to your adversaries. Don't have a perpetuation of the Cold War because it led to nowhere in the 1950s and early 60s. Then came the war. So extend that hand, work for some rapprochement, and yeah, extend that hand of friendship. Have offer help, of course, in return for important concessions. And that was always the deal and always the debate. But they really learned from the Marshall Plan. And I would also say that was also true in the post Cold War period when the Soviet Union collapsed. Kohl. He quoted that we learned from the Marshall Plan. He quoted that in a conversation with Bill Clinton in March 1993 in terms of what should the Western approach be towards Yeltsin. We have to help him. He's our best hope in Russia, so we should apply the Marshall Plan logic, right? And that's what Kohl did in the post-Cold War era. So it's a continuing theme, I think, during the Cold War and afterwards.
Okay. I don't know if we have Vladislav still with us, do we?
I think so. If I could ask a question to all three of you, some 30 years after 1989, 32 years after 1989, what do you see as the kind of emerging lessons of 1989? Because I think, I mean, it is a particular moment, but it's a moment, obviously, when in some ways the near future of Europe is redefined, but it's in a way redefined by very much by one side. So I wonder whether we have a shared sense of lessons of 1989 or very much, if that's still very much contested ground.
If I may say a few words, I think I'm not sure what can be so-called objective lessons of 1989, but people, it's in the eye of the beholder, so people draw different lessons. And I think, Vladimir Putin drew a very major lesson, keep your powder dry, but above all, keep a lot of money aside just in case. Because what happened, West Germany had a deep pocket, and the Soviet Union didn't have one. And also because of Gorbachev's economic and financial and political reforms launched in '88 and early '89, the Soviet government remarkably quickly, lost control over, even the money that they had. People in Western literature, people pay most of attention to the fall of oil prices. That definitely had some effect, but a much more significant effect had the liberalization of trade in 1988 in the Soviet Union, for instance, and the system of shady deals that immediately sprung up among ministries and state enterprises and others that defunded the state essentially, and that is a remarkable lesson of 1989. The role of money. Of course, people pay a lot of attention to freedom. Freedom in a sense became the motto of 1989, and in a sense reflects the ideology of the winners. If you like, American West European intellectual hegemony to explain what happened. But most of the people from East Berlin, correct me if I'm wrong, ran to look at KDV, not to experience freedom. Maybe they didn't even know how to experience freedom at that time. So another way of interpreting these events should be to look at the role of finances and economic power. Another question, we of course, I listened with great interest to both papers of my German colleagues, and Stephan is absolutely correct that the long détente and Wandlung durch Annäherung had put the Soviets in the corner in many ways. Yet I wouldn't push it too far, because it's one thing when you try to handle deeply conservative governments such as Brezhnev's and Andropov's, and especially Honecker, you can achieve wonderful things. And 8 million Germans, I saw them in 1986. That was my first trip abroad into East Berlin. I saw all of them, but I also saw the wall. And as a Soviet citizen, I had no right to cross this wall into West Berlin. I was deeply humiliated and eye-opening. And in a sense, everyone understood on the Soviet side that, yes, for the Honecker leadership, it's an existential question. It's a question of political power. It's a question of political regime. That's why I mentioned this episode on Gorbachev and Shevardnadze kind of probed Honecker on the wall in 1987. Honecker predictably said, no, of course not, and they backed off. And that was an understanding that somehow this was an insurmountable obstacle that somehow would be taken over by the process of integration and East-West common European home and all that stuff. And that didn't happen. So I would still put an emphasis on a revolutionary change. It's too easy to claim that, hey, you had this laid out trap, excellent trap, and then the Soviets gradually walked into it. But all my material says, well, they realized there was a trap to begin with. At the same time, they underestimated the fragility and the vulnerability of the GDR. The famous conversation between Shevardnadze and Kuczynski was sent as Soviet ambassador to Bonn. And Shevardnadze asked him, do you foresee any major changes in the next few years? And the conversation was in 87, I believe. And Kuczynski said, no, there are two German nations. There are two German nations. They're established two German nations that will exist. And Shevardnadze, being a Georgian, of course, at the time already had strong doubt about it. But nobody could predict that it would happen within 2 years.
Dr. Zubok, I have a question for you, again, about reform in Berlin. I was struck by your comment that the Soviets didn't really want a reform in Berlin. I'm wondering about, there seems to be a theme throughout the superpower confrontation in Berlin that there was always the desire, a superpower desire to change things, but an inability to do so because it would challenge the status quo. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit in the 1980s.
Oh, well, nobody knew how to approach this subject because the consequences were too unpredictable. And even most liberal people around Gorbachev, I quoted Chernyshев, I quoted Chekhnazarov, they were veterans of war who, however, didn't hold any venom against Germany and Germans. They were very much pro-détente and they were great supporters of the common European home. Yet I don't think they expected that this question of Berlin Wall would kind of leap out and take the front lines so suddenly. It was a question of a sequence. It was a question of priorities. It was a question of moving step by step. I mentioned the gradualist scenario, because those people, it's wrong to think that Chernyshев and Chekhnazarov and all the rest of them, and Gorbachev, they were fixated on foreign policy. No, they treated foreign policy as a tool for facilitating domestic reforms. So they knew that, okay, after Stalin's death, Khrushchev and somebody else, Malenkov and others, started reforms, very, very modest reforms, of course. But then 1956 snuffed it out in a moment. Then, of course, there was a thaw. And then the Prague Spring broke out, and the leadership got scared, and the reformist movement was snuffed up in the moment. That was their main scare, I think, throughout 88 and 89. And all their moves and all their motivations cannot be understood without this scare of jeopardizing the far-reaching domestic reforms. And indeed, they were jeopardized. As you can see, the post-wall effect was disastrous for Gorbachev. I mean, things were really going badly for him before, as I mentioned. And he stepped on too many mines, petards, whatever. But after the wall, that kind of became hopeless. Everyone thought of falling dominoes. And I remember myself, a young a young guy at the time. I said to a Polish professor at the end of '89, in 1 year we won't see the red flag over the Kremlin. I remember my own words because there was euphoria. There was incredible euphoria, and nothing could stop it, those processes. So, yeah.
Well, this actually kind of ties into one question in the comments too, on sort of the lasting effects of the solidarity movement that had, of course, started about a decade earlier in earnest. Vladislav, you have made the point that we look at Hungary, but maybe should look more closely at Poland in the losing of control sequence, I suppose, in the late 1980s. How far back in Polish history? Is there a pretty clear line to be drawn, say, from solidarity to the downfall of the Soviet Union?
Well, the Soviet Union was in a bad shape already, I would say, at the moment when solidarity began to come to power. The solidarity example, the round table, well, for Gorbachev, when he gave a green light to Jaruzelski, not that he wanted to give any green lights. I mentioned that he was against any of this. But of course, Jaruzelski being, Jaruzelski asked him, what do you think if we initiate a round table? And Gorbachev said it's a wonderful idea. And of course, originally it was because it sort of meant a gradualist change when everybody knew Polish temper, particularly the Russians from the history of way back to the 19th century. Nobody wanted another explosion of Polish temper. That would have been the end for perestroika, to be sure. So they kind of gradually interacted with the Poles, and it worked until the wall. And even into December 1989, you saw practically one of the last functional meeting of the Warsaw Treaty Organization, where Jaruzelski came from Poland, but also Tadeusz Mazowiecki came from Poland, and they sat next to each other. It looked like, okay, it's possible. You can move very, very slowly, but then the opposition. Not in the Baltic states. The Baltic states had been, Baltic nationalism had been attuned to earlier lessons. They, including solidarity, including, the previous history. But the example of solidarity was picked up by the Russian opposition in Moscow. The opposition that called themselves Democratic Russia, people around Yeltsin, and throughout 1990 they began to discuss how to organize the solidarity, and in the first half of 1991, they basically got ready to take over the leadership in Moscow. It's incredible to read the minutes. They're so full of themselves, like they're gung-ho, and that's after Tiananmen. That's after a signal from China that things can go terribly wrong for them. They're full of absolute certitude that history is on their side. I mean, so-called Russian Democrats. I call themselves Russian Democrats. And basically, Gorbachev is Jaruzelski, whose time is up, and they need only to mobilize workers for a while and come to power. Wiser guys kept telling him, hey, it's not Poland. It's the Soviet Union, it's Russia, there's a Ukrainian issue, there's other issues. But they hardly listened. So yes, in a sense, there was this interesting thread you can follow from the Polish solidarity to the Polish round table, and then, of course, to the Russian radical opposition to Gorbachev in 1990-91. But I would not really ascribe to this factor the primary role in the destruction of the Soviet Union. In a sense, I would describe this factor to Gorbachev himself. The guy just dismantled the old system step by step, remarkably, in part in response to pressure, in part because he had a vision. And this already had begun to happen in 1987 and 88, shockingly early.
Thank you. I do want to get to at least one other question in the comments, and maybe two. One coming from Edgar Liebman is on whatever happened to local actors, say, for example, the mayors in Berlin. There are some towering figures early in the Cold War, into the middle of the Cold War, Willy Brandt himself, but in the 70s and 80s, in this sort of post-quadripartite environment, did they still play a role shaping some of the processes that you've described, Stephan and Peter?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it was very common for West Berlin's mayors to travel to the United States and have meetings with high-ranking US politicians, even with the president. And East Bush also attended to these meetings and also made his promises that to take care about Berlin and take care about some issues. But beyond that, nothing happened then later on in 1989. I think maybe it was a bit different under the Reagan administration because he put more effort in Berlin. But they were regularly traveling to the United States at least once a year to have meetings there on Capitol Hill with President, Secretary of State, and other politicians from the capital to appeal for their cause.
I see.
Yeah, and other policymakers. I mean, I have one particular case when Charles Golodkowski even negotiated with the West Berlin Senator Karl König in the 1960s. That was even before the breakthrough of Ostpolitik, when Charles had his first meetings with policymakers from West Berlin. So that was kind of a precursor for what came later. So Karl König was the senator for economics and also had the backing of Brandt when Brandt was foreign minister in the 60s. And they were already trying to negotiate on human alleviations and travel, but they did not come very far because that was before Ostpolitik and there was too much domestic opposition. But perhaps we could also look at König or at other figures that served as mediators or facilitators of such contacts, maybe less prominent, but still important. So Berlin was also a laboratory for Ostpolitik or for what came later back at the time.
I see. Thank you. We have a couple minutes, and actually the last question here in the comments allows us to be bridge builders, which of course we want to be, towards the concluding question of this, whether we are in a new Cold War or the old one or nothing of the kind, which is whether we see similar economic patterns to those of the later stages in the Cold War today in the engagement or lack thereof of the US and China. And I wonder if maybe Stephan in particular, put you on the spot here since you're from the wrong side of the hyphen in Baden-Württemberg. So I feel good about that. I know this is well outside of your geography, but it does fit well within your thematic approach. And so I wonder if this is something you've come across by way of comparison in looking at just basically commentary in the 21st century, wondering, hey, this does look familiar, or this is really quite different.
There's lots of comparisons between the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. Sometimes my feeling is that there was some more communication and some more order and some more confidence building in the late Cold War compared to today. When you take a look at all the Reagan and Gorbachev conversations, Kohl, Gorbachev, Schulz, Shevardnadze, you had a lot of confidence building. A lot of, George Shultz called it gardening, a constant effort for diplomacy. Yeah, you had a lot of that, a lot of confidence building, starting with small steps. You had military observers within the CSCE framework. Nowadays, you have huge military maneuvers again in Europe without any kind of observers, right? Russian maneuvers, I don't know, 100,000, 150,000 troops in Ukraine. NATO sends tens thousands of soldiers to Eastern Europe. This is really dangerous. this is dangerous. And back in the Cold War, policymakers were concerned about that. I mean, Schmidt and Brezhnev, they had been in the war. They had their maps comparing divisions and military strength on both sides. They were scared, and they knew the danger of war and how quickly this could escalate. And nobody's. I mean, today. My impression is that policymakers are no longer aware of accidental war. What happens if such a maneuver goes wrong? What happens in the Baltic states or in Kaliningrad, where you have so many personnel and so many weapons? And this is again, I think so. My guess is, my take would be, today we are in a more dangerous situation than in the late Cold War, perhaps, in terms of public awareness and in terms of policymakers' awareness, because this is not an issue that is being discussed in the public discourse, or maybe there should be more. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on this, Peter and Vlad? Or am I completely mistaken? I'm not sure.
Not maybe, but I would disagree a little. I mean, comparing the Cold War with the situation today is very difficult, because the situation today is completely different from the 1980s. And I don't think that there's the same level of threat today that we had in the early 1980s or even in the mid and late 1980s. Concerning the economy, I mentioned the fear of a US decline in the late 1980s. And I mean, if you look at the US economy today, the same problems which were troubling the United States in the late 80s were still existing. I mean, the huge deficit in the federal budget, the high military spending, and the growing social inequality are still problems today in the United States, so that haven't changed a lot. But the situation in Russia has changed a lot. Russia today is a capitalist country, and I mean, I don't know how the economy in Russia is doing today, but I would assume that it's still much better than in 1989. So we have two capitalist states today, with the United States and Russia competing against each other. But that makes it even more unlikely, I think, to have a military confrontation, because it would be a major disadvantage for both countries. And another big difference is, of course, that we don't have these ideological differences anymore. The idea of socialism doesn't. It maybe still exists in Russia, but it's not the political policy today. So this ideology who shaped the Cold War is gone today. And the differences we see today or were produced today, I think, are not on the same level as we saw them during the Cold War. That's why
I hate to cut this short, but we are just a little bit past 3 o'clock, and we're in fact getting to the question whether we are in a new Cold War here. I'll just say thank you very much for this, and of course, I all the more look forward to reading the book and do some of the legwork for that. So for our sort of final salvo in this symposium, we turn to the concluding talk. I'd like to once again thank our sponsors, Checkpoint Charlie Foundation, the German Foreign Office and its consulate at Chicago, the Society for Military History, and Ohio University's Baker Peace Studies program. And so you notice we've already started talking about this question, whether we're in a new Cold War. It is one that frequently appears in media and public discourse, and I think it's usually not too well defined, and seems to kind of assume that there's continuity of tensions between the US and China or Russia, sometimes extending this metaphor into regional crises, some of which do harken back to the Cold War, for example, on the Korean Peninsula or in the South China Sea. Yet, thinking about our 3 panel discussions yesterday and today as a whole, I think it's pretty clear that the Cold War itself changed its complexion over time. And so then the question poses several challenges. One is whether the situation we find ourselves in is all that comparable to the recent past. And the other is what exactly do we mean by Cold War and when in the Cold War? So to reflect on the question, are we in a new Cold War? We have with us this afternoon Wolfgang Mössinger, long-serving German Foreign Service officer, and since July 2019, the German Consul General at Chicago. Among his previous posts were 3 years spent in Moscow in the early 2000s and more recent deployments to Baku, 2012 to 15, I believe, and then Donetsk, very much contested ground in the eastern reaches of Ukraine. In fact, 2015 to 2019, with the German consulate currently located in Dnipro. One could thus surmise that he spent much of the 2010s in contested borderlands of the former Soviet Union. And I'm curious very much to hear your thoughts on whether we are in a new Cold War. Wolfgang Mössinger.
Hello, good afternoon from Chicago, and thank you for inviting me to make this this concluding speech. Compared to the speakers before me, I have it probably a little bit more difficult because as a historian myself, it is a pretty kind of safe territory to talk about history on the basis of thorough and scientific studies on historical sources. But now speaking on the present and maybe even on the future, that is of course much more difficult. So, and as I understand, this whole symposium has been recorded. In a couple of years' time, I might be proven completely wrong in what I'm going to say now. But in my view, to continue the discussion about Cold War into 21st century, I could say that my own recent personal history has been influenced by my perspective on this question considerably. I had hoped, as many others, that the end of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe would ring in the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama put it in his famous article 1989, the prevalence of liberal democracies as the universal form of government. I saw with my own eyes what the Cold War was about, the Berlin Wall and the Zonengrenze, the barbed wire border in the middle of Germany. Here was a clear and obvious borderline, not between countries, but between systems. On my last post before coming to Chicago, I served as the German Consul General in Dnipro, Ukraine, as head of our consulate, which was evacuated from Donetsk. In this capacity, I visited the so-called contact line between the territory controlled by the Ukrainian state and its army on the one side, and the Russian-backed separatists on the other side. The similarities were striking. Crossing was only possible at heavily guarded transit points. The border between the two authorities mined, and an ideological rift within one people who spoke the same language and who shared, theoretically, the same citizenship. There are differences between these two situations, of course. Either side did not object to people traveling from one side to the other, even if both controlled tightly who could come and what they could bring along. There was not such a big gap in standard of life, but the economic system did already start to become different. But the most obvious difference was on freedom. On one side, freedom of speech, free elections that ousted an incumbent president, freedom of press, even if journalists investigating corruption scandals lived a dangerous life. On the other side, people disappeared in basements as makeshift prisons. Some show trials against opposition people or simply people who did uphold their Ukrainian identity. And this side only survived through the support of Russia, economically, politically, and most crucially, militarily. Yes, that is the new borderline between democracy and authoritarianism, the Berlin Wall of the 21st century. And it is a systemic rivalry, not between capitalism and communism, but now into a more traditional rivalry on territory and on spheres of influence. The Ukrainian people today and the peoples of Central European countries during the time of the Warsaw Pact shared one aspiration: to decide freely which path their country should follow. When President Biden and Chancellor Merkel explicitly demanded that all people in Europe should be free to decide about their political future without foreign interference, Angela Merkel knew from personal experience what that means, and now, as then, the power who does not grant this freedom is located in Moscow. One of the reasons Francis Fukuyama claimed the end of history was that Russia in the 90s seemed to align its economic and political system with ours. But it created a terribly unstable and unsafe situation for ordinary Russians that they often did not see the new political system as beneficial to them. They longed for a strong leader whom they got with Putin. He restored order in the country, but an order of its own kind. It took us and the Russian people quite a while to understand the nature of his regime. Yes, he strengthened the security apparatus and made it work to his personal benefits and to the benefits of his loyal followers inside and outside of government. Nothing new in that. But it went unnoticed for a long time that he has a much more elaborate concept in mind and how he sees the world. Don't forget that for him it was a traumatic experience when he was head of the KGB office in Dresden, when the East German uprising brought the communist government down. People protesting outside his residence and nobody there to protect him. Neither the East German Volkspolizei nor Russian troops, and nobody answered phone calls in Moscow. Remember further that he called the demise of the Soviet Union the biggest tragedy of the 20th century. Not the Holocaust, not the Gulag, not World War I, not World War II. The demise of the Soviet Union. What is his ideology, if there is one? It is simple. Russia is different from all other countries, and that it must not follow the example of others, and especially not the West. This state doctrine is based on Putin's favorite philosopher, Ivan Ilyin, who lived from 1883 to 1954 and who propagated that Russia is not a country that could ever be run on democratic principles. Putin resurrected this man literally. Ilyin died in exile in Switzerland, but Putin's close cultural advisor, film director Nikita Mikhalkov, got his body exhumed and reburied in the cemetery of the Donskoy Monastery in Moscow. Ilyin's work is now an integral part of the history curriculum of Russian schools. Young Russians are now indoctrinated by this doctrine that Russia simply cannot and must not become a liberal democracy in the sense of how we know it. And the argument goes beyond the philosophical. Russia has to prove that her government system is superior to the Western model. How can you do this when it is obvious that living standards of Russians still remain far below of most in Western Europe? First of all, you cannot allow a country with a similar history and within the Orthodox world to become an economically successful and democratic country. That is why Ukraine must fail as a state, must stay back economically, and must not become an example of how a post-Soviet state can become a member of the community of democratic countries. One way to make sure that this is not going to happen is to involve it in a war, disguised as a civil war. I'm often asked what Putin envisages with the occupation of Donbass. My guess is that he is completely happy with the status quo, destabilizing Ukraine. That's all he wanted to achieve, and he managed that very fine. The other path of making sure that Russians' aspirations for democracy does not become dangerous for his regime, Putin engages in all kinds of methods to undermine democracies and to make them look bad and incompetent. All his disinformation campaign has two audiences, his home audience and the audience abroad. I can recommend to subscribe to the EU Disinformation Unit reviews. It is not only clear in uncovering the disinformation, it's also very fun to read. Yes, you can make fun of some of the Russian claims, like a group of young activists from Donetsk, whose art space is now occupied by the separatist forces and used as a detention camp. They invaded the Russian pavilion at the Venice Biennale, disguised as Russian soldiers carrying a sticker on the back, "On holidays," referring to the claim of Putin that the occupation of Donbass was actually an internal uprising, and the Russian soldiers who happened to be there to support were just there on holidays and actually bringing their tanks along. Of course, it is serious, but these types of claims show that the Russian leadership does not care about what we think about them. They know exactly that no reasonable person can believe these tales, but they do not care. Despite the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the aggressive attitude from Russia in Europe and elsewhere, I'm confident that Putin's ideology will not be successful in the West. The best example is the fact that before the pandemic, every year, hundreds of thousands of young, well-educated Russians left the country to the West for working, studying, or simply looking for a life in which they can fulfill their dreams. Emigration in the other direction rarely happens. Other than Edward Snowden and Gérard Depardieu, I don't know of anybody who emigrated from the West to Russia, and both had their specific reasons. So the systemic challenge from Russia exists, serious, but will not be able to alter. Prepared to engage for our democracies, as long as we are prepared to speak out and to use our own minds in making decisions. But there is another threat to our way of life, and in my view, a more substantial one, and that is China. During the time of the Cold War, China was merely a sideshow in the conflict. Remember when President Nixon traveled to Peking and managed to drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and China. Remember when Chinese and Soviet troops shot at each other at the Ussuri River in 1969. These were times when China sought to outdo the Soviet Union ideologically, economically, militarily, and on the international scene. And yes, they managed without giving up the power monopoly of the Communist Party. Today, China is the systemic rival to the West. There is, in my view, a big difference, though, between the rivalry today with China and the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. China applies all the tactics of Russia to undermine trust in the effectiveness of the democratic system by disseminating fake news. But to the opposite of the Soviet Union, at the time, it has no ambition to force their political system onto us. It is a more classical struggle about influence and world power without a specific ideological claim. The systems compete on who is better equipped to solve domestic problems and who can exercise influence, even power, on other regions in the world. That is why this competition is more difficult to win than the one with Russia. China has proven that their system works well to lift millions of people out of poverty, to create a booming middle class, and to be on the edge of science and technology. Yes, some of these achievements come from illegal activities like theft of patents, bullying companies into submission, and buying leaders from other countries to exploit the natural resources. And yes, the human rights record of China is even worse than Russia's if you look at Tibet, the Uyghurs, or Hong Kong. Nevertheless, the economic success of the country leaves many people doubtful whether we can match this success with the cumbersome procedures of democratic systems or with a wavering multilateral order that tilts more and more in China's favor. That is why the German government and others are trying to engage with China without giving up on our values. We need to cooperate with China on many global issues. Climate change mitigation is probably the most urgent and important one. Engaging China also means to make China at least as dependent on international cooperation as we are dependent on China. There is another difference between China and Russia. Chinese do care on how they are seen in the world, as they want to engage with us. Instead of sanctions, shaming and blaming is probably more successful. At the same time, we need to disentangle us from China, building up supply chains that work without Chinese cooperation. This is not a contradiction to what I just said. It is a dual approach which will make us viable and serious negotiating partner for China. We have to make sure that we can say no on occasions without being pressured into saying maybe. And we have some advantages that all authoritarian regimes always underestimate when they judge liberal democracies and market economies. The drive of individuals to innovate independent from government orders or incentives. The flexibility of our societies to adapt to new challenges. The freedom of thought and of action, and the willingness to preserve this by engaging in decision-making processes on all levels. That is why it is so important to keep or regain the edge on technology. Technology is the field on which the Cold War of the 21st century will be won. Therefore, the creation of a US-EU Trade and Technology Council is crucial. Already the first meeting held last week proved the usefulness of this creation by agreeing on a wide-ranging agenda for 7 working groups. It is my belief that if US and Europe define together how the technology of today and of tomorrow should shape our lives, our businesses, our education, our politics, we can unleash the creativity of many people, not only in our countries but around the world, to develop these technologies along the lines defined by democratically elected leaders and not by interests of business leaders or of autocrats. If we manage to keep this drive alive, we can secure this freedom by engaging personally in developing our society forward. We will not only preserve our liberal democracies, we will also keep them more attractive than all other systems. Winston Churchill's famous quote still stands: "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried unsuccessfully." It is up to us to keep it the least bad form of government. If we manage that, we will prevail, not by winning this new Cold War, but by diffusing it. So thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to answer questions.
Vielen Dank, Herr Bösinger. Thank you. I do invite questions. We have about 10 minutes or so. And I sort of wonder about 2 or 3 themes myself. One is, I mean, with China, I think there is a lot more continuity, of course, and you cannot, it's not the same sharp end of the Cold War that kind of characterized the moment in 1989 to 91 in Europe. But this theme you started out with on strong leaders, where certainly Putin is an example, Xi Jinping is an example, there is a somewhat depressingly large number and growing number of examples elsewhere too. And so I wonder about the appeal. Is the appeal different from country to country? Is it, I mean, Brazil, Hungary, Turkey, Russia and China, and others, not coming from within the same ideology. And so I wonder about that moment.
Yeah, I think you are right that we are in a defining moment in the history of democracies in general. And that is whether democracies are able to create a society which is beneficial for all, or at least for the overall majority of people. And I think we have to be very critical to ourselves. In the last 10, 20, 30 years, globalization might have been run without having in mind that it should be run for a majority of the people and not just for an elite. Globalization turned out now to have been an elite project, which forgot on the way a lot of what it means for people to lose their job because companies go where it's cheaper to produce, where the taxes are lower, where environmental and labor standards are lower. We had a hard awakening with a couple of elections in the last 10 years in some countries, where we never thought that people who are questioning the multilateral order and the globalization would ever be successful to come to power. But that's what I mean with the flexibility and the openness of our democratic systems. I think we have at least started to learn the lessons. I mean, President Biden's program of building back better and having a foreign policy for the middle class is, I think, a clear sign that things have to change without changing the framework of multilateral order. But to think more in what you do on trade, in what you do on international relations and multilateralism, on globalization, to always think about the repercussions that it has at home to your people, to the people voting for you, and for those people you're actually elected to serve. That is, I think, a clear difference to a couple of years ago. Of course, it's in the beginning, the process is in the beginning, but I think our democratic processes are strong enough to force the leaders now to think much more in this direction. And if you look at the German elections just a week ago, of course, it's a very difficult issue now. The interpretation of the election result could take at least one more seminar for about a week or so. But what you could see is that the AfD has peaked. They are still very strong in certain regions, and they are now a well-established part of our political spectrum. I wouldn't say of the democratic spectrum, but of the political spectrum. But they have peaked, and that despite the fact that we had the crisis of COVID, still having the crisis of COVID, and still having all the challenges that our societies face now, with many people probably have kind of a very bleak view onto their future. That gives me the optimism to say that our democracies are able to reform themselves without collapsing, like authoritarian regimes cannot reform themselves without collapsing. We have seen that in the 1980s with the Soviet Union. The Chinese have, of course, reformed themselves in a way, in an economical way, but not necessarily in a political way. So that is still something that is ahead of them. So that's why I'm optimistic, but I share your concern that we are in a very important phase of the development of democracies, with many of these authoritarian, autocratic leaders winning elections. But I think we have to simply rethink our approach on globalization and on multilateralism and on economic policies. And then I think the people love freedom. And when they see that a free democratic society gives them also the economic and personal perspectives to thrive in that society, I think they will be easily convinced again that the democracy is always better than to obey an authoritarian leader.
Well, in that sense, I think 1989 offers some degree of hope. But this also gets me to, I think, the final question from the comments, and that is, for Europeans in particular, there's long-standing engagement with Russia on elite levels of diplomacy, decades and hundreds of years even. Less so with China. Do we understand China enough to kind of engage constructively in ways that could be possible with Russia?
Yeah, of course, we don't understand the Chinese as well as the Russians because not that many people in Europe speak Chinese. And I'm not only historian, I'm also a linguist, and I understand that languages is something very, very important to understand a country's thinking and people's thinking. So maybe we should furthermore to learn also the Chinese language. I know the Chinese are doing a lot to make people learn languages all over the world, but sometimes we laugh at it, say, why do you do that? But I think it's a good idea to do it. But apart from that, look, Angela Merkel went every year to China. And there was a lot of criticism also in the United States about saying, the Germans are too lenient or the Europeans are too lenient with China. And now then there was this trade deal or investment deal late December last year, which was also seen as if Germany or Europe is trying to do kind of equidistant between China and America. I think that's completely a misconception of what this trade deal and investment deal is about. And that's exactly what you mentioned. We need to engage with China. We don't need to give in into our standards, our values, but we need to engage with them, especially also on climate change. There's no chance to get the climate change somehow under control if China does not participate in that. And I think this is the way to go forward. Of course, we will differ in many ways in human rights issues and on how the multilateral order should function. But if we don't engage with China, we can't influence anything there. And what I wanted to say is that the good thing in the relations with China, they do not have the ambition to reform our systems to make it like theirs, which was the Soviet Union was trying to do in the Cold War era. From that point of view, this stumbling block of relations is not there, is out of the way. So we can really engage in more, I would say, pragmatic discussions and not having this ideological ballast on our shoulders all the time.
Well, thank you very much, Wolfgang Mersinger, and thanks also to all of our speakers these last couple days and a half. This concludes our symposium on Berlin and the Cold War. I'd like to point out that the links on YouTube will stay active. You can share those with your friends. There's no way to ask questions, but you can always track me down in email, and I can track speakers down in email if you have particular questions that seem relevant. Thank you to Seth Givens, Connie Hunter, for all your work around this conference, and it is good